disease. For Listeria, for example, it's about 1,000. So the whole idea is just to get those numbers down, so even though the pathogens may be there, they won't cause disease. There are two main types of pasteurization used today. The regular pasteurization is actually technically called high temperature short time, and that heats it to 161 degrees for 15 to 20 seconds. And then the UHT, ultra heat treated, is 280 degrees for a fraction of a second. And as we pointed out last night, 280 degrees is way above the boiling point. You could not do that to milk in a pan on your stove unless you boiled it all down and burnt it. Both treatments involve rapid heating by forcing the milk between superheated stainless steel plates. And as we explained last night, all of these components, not all of them, but a majority of them are actually proteins. And proteins are very complicated three-dimensional objects, and when you heat them this quickly, this unnaturally, and of course with this amount of heat, they get kind of warped and bent and distorted. The electrical charges on the surface of the proteins change. They just aren't the way they were before in the body, and they don't work as well as they did before, and the body thinks they're foreign and has to mount an immune response. We've heard a lot about coliforms recently. I added these slides when we were working with the new regulations in California. The Department of Health there kind of sprung a fast one on us and suddenly said the milk has to have 10 coliforms or less, the raw milk, which is the standard they have for pasteurized milk. It has to have 10 coliforms or less. And this is very hard to achieve in raw milk because coliforms just mean basically microorganisms, and most coliforms are beneficial. So the dairies out there have been able to meet these standards, but they have to basically make sure that the measurement takes place just almost immediately after the cows are milked, because they start to increase after that. So what are coliforms? They are rod-shaped bacteria found everywhere in the environment, including the gut, the feces, the soil, the water, and plants. They are just everywhere. There are four main groups: E. coli, can't pronounce this one, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, and Citrobacter. So E. coli sounds really, scary and everything, but very, very few strains of E. coli cause illness. Most of them are benign and beneficial. Their key characteristic is that they ferment lactose into lactic acid. Research results have shown that total coliforms may not be an appropriate bacterial indicator of fecal pollution. Just because you have coliforms in a food or milk does not mean that it has been in contact with manure. Significant concentrations of coliforms in distribution systems do not represent a health risk to water consumers. If you have coliforms in your water, it's not necessarily a health risk. So with few exceptions, coliforms themselves are not considered to be a health risk unless you are a public health official trying to find a reason to denigrate raw milk. It is widely accepted that total coliform group of bacteria is diverse, and they can be considered normal inhabitants of many soil and water environments that have not been impacted by fecal pollution. So coliforms do not equal fecal pollution. In fact, the coliforms in raw milk inhibit pathogen growth. Enterococci, considered virulent and are antibiotic resistant in hospitals, inhibit pathogens such as Listeria in raw feta cheese. That was published in 2000. Lactobacillus and Staphylococcus produce bacteriocins against Listeria monocytogenes and are sold as commercial starters to control Listeria. They're sold as commercial starters in the dairy industry itself. And various coliforms in raw milk inhibit something that is pathogenic, Staph aureus. The notion that we have to get rid of all the microorganisms in our food and our milk and our water and so forth is actually based on a completely discredited scientific paradigm. The old paradigm was that the healthy human body is sterile and it is attacked by microbes and the microbes make it sick. We now know that the human body lives in symbiotic relationship with microorganisms. A healthy human being has from 5 to 6 pounds of healthy bacteria in the gut. These are much, much smaller than our cells, so we actually have about 10 times more bacteria in our gut than we do cells in our body. And without these bacteria, we'd actually be dead. They do many, many things for us, including help digest our food, and they protect us against toxins. They prevent the absorption of toxins. So we want to be taking in foods that support that bacteria, and raw milk is one of the best foods to do this. So arguments for pasteurization are based on this discredited paradigm. And in fact, we have many medical uses for these coliform bacteria. Some doctors are now treating diarrhea by reseeding the colon with coliforms, okay, with actual fecal bacteria. Lactobacillus is used to combat rotaviruses that cause diarrhea and intestinal inflammation in children. Streptococcus nasal spray is being used to combat pathogens that cause ear infections. Lactobacilla is being added to wounds to prevent staph infection. Okay, no longer are we forward-thinking people in medicine thinking about sterilizing wounds, but about putting good bacteria there. And a harmless strain of E. coli injected into the bladder has been used to successfully combat urinary tract infections. So the whole idea of how the role of microorganisms is changing radically and gives us a new appreciation for all of the good things in raw milk. When we talk about the safety of food, I'm not going to make a statement that raw milk has never made somebody sick. It might have. I think it's highly doubtful, but it might have, okay? Even this wonderful system can be overwhelmed. But what we need to look at is in relationship to what? What is the risk of getting sick from raw milk or even pasteurized milk compared to other foods? And where should we be putting our emphasis and our attention with this widespread problem of foodborne illness? And milk, as it turns out, is relatively safe whether pasteurized or raw. There's very few outbreaks and cases of foodborne illness from raw milk compared to other foods. This was just 1997, where there were 23 cases of illness attributed to milk, mostly pasteurized milk, and 1,104 attributed to salads, which we're, of course, encouraged to eat raw, right? Here was a study done 1990 to 2004 looking at number of outbreaks and number of cases, and seafood had the most number of outbreaks. This is raw oysters and things like this, sushi, which of course we're allowed to eat raw, don't have to be pasteurized. The number of cases was from produce. And once again, here's another way of looking at it. This is illnesses, number of illnesses, fish and shellfish, poultry, eggs, beef, pork, produce, and dairy. This is 1999 to 2006. And yet you can go down to a fairly dirty wharf and buy raw oysters, and that's perfectly legal. While raw milk often gets the blame for foodborne illnesses, Campylobacter, which is the most common cause of foodborne illness, is best known for contaminating meats. This was a survey done in 1999-2000 of Washington, D.C. grocery stores. They found that almost 71% of the chicken samples tested positive for Campylobacter. Turkey was about 15%, beef and pork much lower. Next. Now, Listeria monocytogenes, we hear about this a lot. It can be, certain strains of Listeria can